Point 3, this distinctive work of this age. It's important to know when Spirit baptism began and what the result is. Because in different forms of replacement theology, where they claim that the church is the true Israel, they therefore claim that the church existed already in the Old Testament. And some begin the church with Adam, others begin the church with Abraham to connect the church with the Abrahamic covenant. And therefore God did not make his covenantal promises with real, literal, ethnic Israel. He made the covenants with spiritual Israel, which is the church. And that's why many of them do not believe God has any special future for the people of Israel and reject the concept of a final restoration of Israel and the Jewish people into the promised land. However, as we're about to see, the determine when the church really began is determined upon the timing of Spirit baptism. Now we're going to deal with 4 passages and we'll see the logic. First of all, Colossians chapter 1, verse 18. Colossians 1:18 says, the church is the body of the Messiah. The church is the body of the Messiah. So the body of the Messiah is the church is the body of the Messiah. That's the first point. For the second point, let's look at it to make sure we understand. And look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. First Corinthians chapter 12, verse 13 says, for by one Spirit were we all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether bond or free, all made to drink of one Spirit. The thing to notice here is this. He says, by one Spirit were we all baptized into one body. No exceptions. Every believer has been baptized by the Spirit, and note the result of Spirit baptism is not any specific spiritual gift. The result of Spirit baptism is membership in the body, and the body, according to Colossians 1:18, is the church. So there is this inseparable connection between Spirit baptism and the existence of the body. One cannot exist apart from the other. So if we can determine exactly when Spirit baptism begins, that will tell us when the church began. So that will take us now to our third passage, which is the book of Acts, chapter 1. Acts 1. The only gospel that actually mentions the church happens to be the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 16, and once again in Matthew chapter 18. But he says about the church, he says, upon this rock I will build my church, using a future tense, which shows that in Matthew 16, the church did not yet exist. If the church was already here from Adam or Abraham, then he would say, upon this rock I will continue to build the church. But that's not what he says. He says, upon this rock I will build my church, using the future tense. And so the church was still future as of Matthew chapter 16. And now look at Acts chapter 1, verse 5, Acts 1:5. For John indeed baptized with water, but she shall be baptized by the Holy Spirit not many days hence. And notice again the future tense. He points out the Spirit baptism had not yet begun. It will begin not many days hence, but had not yet begun. And that's why the church was not even born yet as of Acts 1. Now the question is, when was Acts 1:5 fulfilled? When did the church finally get into existence? And the obvious answer would be Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, Acts 2, verses 1 through 4. And while that is the correct answer, there is one small problem here. In that he does mention being Spirit-filled in verse 4, as we shall see later this morning. Being Spirit-filled is not the same as being baptized by the Spirit. So how can we be certain that Spirit baptism did occur in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4? If we go to our fourth passage in Acts 11. Acts 11. Now, in chapter 10 of the book of Acts, God sent Peter to a home of uncircumcised Gentiles, the household of Cornelius. And through Peter's testimony, they become believers and are baptized by the Spirit into the body of the Messiah. And furthermore, he stays with them, disciples them, and eats with them at the same table, which went contrary to Jewish practices of that day. A Jewish practice that many Jewish believers still followed, not yet recognizing the new program that God has inaugurated. And now in chapter 10 of Acts, for the first time, uncircumcised Gentiles entered the body of the Messiah. Because Peter broke the normal Jewish tradition about not eating with the uncircumcised Gentiles, in chapter 11, when he comes back to Jerusalem, he's attacked by his fellow Jewish believers. And in verse 2 we read, "And when Peter was come up to Jerusalem, they that were of the circumcision contended with him, saying, Unto men uncircumcised, and did eat with them." And that was a no-no. And so to defend his activities in chapter 10, he does two things. He first of all tells them about the special vision God gave him from heaven, and how could he be disobedient to the heavenly voice. But his second defense is based upon the Acts 1:5 passage. Look at verse 15 and note the change in pronouns. "As I began to speak, Holy Spirit fell on them, even as on us at the beginning." Again, "As I began to speak, the Holy Spirit fell on them." The them are the Gentile believers of Acts 10. "Even as on us," and us are the Jewish believers of the Church of Jerusalem. At the beginning, and the beginning when the Spirit fell upon the Jewish believers was in Acts 2, verses 1 through 4. And now look at verse 16. "And now remember the word of the Lord, how he said, John indeed baptized with water, but ye shall be baptized by the Holy Spirit." And what Peter does here is quotes what the Messiah said back in Acts 1:5. And so by connecting verses 15 and 16 together, we learn Acts 1:5 was fulfilled when the Spirit fell upon the Church of Jerusalem in Acts 2, verses 1 through 4. And that's really when the church was born. That's when Spirit baptism began. So by understanding the very important and distinctive feature of the church age and the Spirit baptism is essential for the church to begin. And the Spirit baptism begins in Acts 2, and that's when the church was born. Now, capital B on your outline, unity. Spirit baptism leads to two types of unity. One type we saw in that 1 Corinthians chapter 12 passage, which unites all believers, Jew, Gentile, male and female, bond and free, into one body. All believers are united. Now look at Ephesians chapter 2, because in Ephesians we see another type of unity, a unity of Jews and Gentiles who believe. I won't take time to read the passage, but it's verses 11 through 16. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 16. And he begins pointing out that God originally had two distinctive ethnic groups, Jews and Gentiles. But the Jewish ethnic group had the advantage that God made certain covenants with them containing covenantal promises. And in verse 12, notice the word covenant is plural, because God made 4 eternal, unconditional covenants with the Jewish people. And we call these covenants today as the Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. And God blesses by means of these 4 covenants. He also points out in verses 13 through 15 that God also made another covenant which was different. And this one was not eternal but temporary. It was not unconditional but conditional. That was the Mosaic covenant containing the 613 commandments of the Mosaic law. There were 9 different purposes for the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic law. The one he deals with here is to serve as the middle wall of partition to you Gentiles as Gentiles away from enjoying the Jewish blessings of the Jewish covenants. So he points out Gentiles were two things in connection with the covenants. Number one, they were strangers to the covenants. Number two, they were far off, too far away to enjoy the benefits. When the Messiah died, he says in verse 15, he broke down the middle wall of partition, the law and commandments. And for what purpose? Look at the end of verse 15. To create in himself of the two. What two? In this context, Jews and Gentiles, one new man. So 2 plus 1 equals 3. There's now a third new entity. And this third new entity comprises all Jews who believe, no Gentiles who believe, united into what? In verse 16, notice, into one body. And again, body in Colossians 1:18 is the church. So the wall of separation is now down, and Jewish and Gentile believers have become united into one body in the Messiah. Now, capital C, another key element involved as a result of unity is sanctification. And we won't read this, but let's look at Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6. What happens in chapter 6 is based upon what he said in chapter 5. In spite of the increase of iniquity and sin, the more sin is increased, the greater was the grace of God. And that raises the question in chapter 6, verse 1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Since God shows more grace when there is more sin, should we keep on sinning so God can become more gracious? And that's a wrong application of what Paul was teaching back in chapter 5. And so his answer comes in verse 2, God forbid. We who died to sin, how shall we any longer live therein? And that's his answer. We have been freed from the authority of the sin nature, but we're not free to sin even more than we did before. And in verses 3 through 10, he gives his explanation. In this explanation, notice 6 things. First of all, in verse 3, that all have been baptized by the Spirit, resulting in membership in the body. Secondly, in verse 4, we have been baptized by the Spirit to live a newness of life, not to sin more, but to sin less, to live a new kind of newness of life. Thirdly, in verse 5, there is a logical sequence, because in water baptism, we have been identified with his death, but now also, and because we also come up out of the water, we've also been resurrected. So we have not only a spiritual death with him, we also have a spiritual resurrection with him, and that should be shown in the way we now live. Fourthly, in verse 6, he gives a theological explanation in that our old man has been crucified. And by crucified doesn't mean the old man is dead. It simply means he has no authority over us anymore. He's still there. And because he's still there, which is why we still sin. But he must recognize that he no longer has authority, and therefore we have the option to obey the old man or the new man. And with the power of the Spirit, we can obey consistently the new man. And then the fifth thing is that he gives the illustration, explanation, and it's a point of the law. He that died is justified from sin. That's a legal issue. Once, in the legal aspect, if we break the Mosaic law and pay the penalty, if we require the death penalty, once we have died by the law of Moses, then that fulfills what the law requires for that sin. By the same token, we have been co-crucified, co-buried, and co-resurrected with the Messiah. And therefore, what was required for our sin by the law has been paid by our substitute. And by Spirit baptism, we have been identified with him. And therefore, we should no longer continue sinning for that reason. And then in the sixth thing is in verses 8 through 10, he gives another sequence involving 3 things. First of all, if we died with the Messiah, we shall also live with him. Secondly, since he was raised from the dead, we shall be raised from the dead.